Hello and welcome to an Infinity the Game faction focus for Svalarheima's Winter Force. In this video, we're talking about who Svalarheima are, how they play, what are their strengths, limitations, and faction identity, before jumping into Infinity Army to go through many of the profiles that showcase the faction. Before we begin, big thanks to Lockie, that's the border on the Discord, for providing a huge amount of input into this video, and a lot of the basis of these speaking notes. Lockie is a long-term Pan-Oceania player, and Svalarheima player in particular. Just last year, he won BrizCon 2025 with Svalarheima, and he was kind enough to take a lot of time to sit down, speak to me, and send through a lot of the notes that have informed a lot of this video. So Lockie, thank you very, very much. If there's something clever or insightful in this video, it probably comes from him. If there's something I get wrong, it definitely comes from me. And with that, let's start by talking about the journey that Svalarheima has been on. Because at release of N5, the faction kind of just ported its N4 identity over wholesale. And that wasn't necessarily a problem because Svalarheima occupied an interesting design niche, but it meant that the edition change wasn't enormously meaningful for the army. I've previously described Pan-Oceania, or Svalarheima rather, as Pan-Oceania with close assault, or to add a little bit more nuance to that, Pan-Oceania with a clear answer to the question of what you do when the enemy has their heads down in the face of your superior firepower. Svalarheima's response to that question was, well, once I've fired all of the bullets and the enemy have their heads thoroughly suppressed, I will send in the close assault elements and win the game that way. I will combine very big, powerful guns with very powerful close assault pieces, and even post N5 update, you could just play Svalarheima using those kind of classic builds, where you would rely on either the Jotun or the Karhu or both, and the same close assault elements that we saw in N4, pieces like Lenkai, Shanakarano, etc. And those were the archetypes that worked, and they were good. And some things have happened only since that have caused a change in that. And that's kind of where the interesting rubber hits the road. So two big changes have occurred in the game generally that have impacted how we approach and play Svalarheima. The first, and probably the most significant, this is in Lockie's opinion and I agree, is actually the ITS Season 17 change. So the introduction of ITS Season 17 partway through N5's life cycle. Because ITS Season 17 represents a fundamental change in mission design and how we are required to approach missions in Infinity. If you've been playing this game for a long time, you'll be aware that ITS seasons wax and wane in terms of how much they ask players to just fight the other player versus how much they ask them to go and pursue mission objectives. And ITS seasons 14, 15, and 16 all represented more of a fight the other player, direct action style of emphasis. There were still missions in those ITS seasons that were very onerous or required a lot of the player, but generally, those seasons had something of a design ethos of the purpose of the scenario is to encourage the players to have a scrap, and the scrap is the interesting point. And we know this because designers, including organized play coordinators like Heloise, have said that that was part of their design goal for some of the previous seasons. But, as with all things, change over time keeps the game fresh, and in ITS Season 17 we've seen, and for me this is very welcome, the pendulum swinging back the other way. ITS Season 17 introduces a slew of new scenarios, and they are demanding. They tend to require a lot of the player. They require you to spread out across the table, accomplish mission objectives in different places. They're usually very order intensive, and even operational learning as a mechanic is kind of emblematic of how you have to invest more time in doing the scenario than you have in the last few ITS seasons. Before ITS Season 17, you would generally have missions that had a specialist bonus. Very comfortable most of the time, you would take a hacker, and that hacker would have a big bonus on their first roll to accomplish the mission, which meant that they would usually succeed the first time. Operational learning puts a cushion under successive failures, but you still have to spend more orders to get the benefit of it as a mechanic. Operational learning doesn't kick in until your second and then third order spent trying to press a button. while that's a small thing, it kind of just serves as a little microcosm to showcase how there have been many changes in Season 17 that make the scenarios more demanding and more order intensive, and we need to adjust our list construction accordingly. And that impacts factions like Svalarheima. Because the previous approach of step 1, shoot the enemy, step 2, run in, assault, and kill the enemy at close range, step 3, do the mission, I guess, does not work anymore. You cannot, generally speaking, follow that kind of a play pattern and expect to have enough orders left to accomplish particularly the more order-intensive scenarios in the current season. And in any case, there are many scenarios that just require different play patterns generally. Play patterns that involve securing or seizing specific bits of territory around a table. Those are kind of new to ITS Season 17 in the way that they play, and they need to be approached differently. Lockie actually calls out very directly in the notes and discussions that I've had with him how much of his list construction now changes to emphasize the value of either pre-positioned or responsive, like rapidly responsive elements, things that either have combat jump, not available in Svalarheima, or infiltration, and especially hidden deployment infiltration, to be able to have pieces in place to efficiently go about doing the scenario as part of your general list plan. And Svalarheima can meet those demands, but it changes certain things inside the faction that are good. One of the things that we'll get to when I talk about individual profiles is how, in my mind, Lang Kai is still excellent, but he's actually not necessarily my first choice for a close assault piece in this faction anymore. Because in 2026, I want close assault pieces that can also potentially accomplish mission objectives, or at least be part of fire teams that are moving with purpose toward a part of the table that I have to assault, seize, secure, and then do some mission objective in, rather than just running around and beating people up, which Lang Kai is very efficient at, but he doesn't contribute as well toward that overall game plan. The other thing that has changed around Svalarheima is, unsurprisingly, changes that have occurred to profiles over the course of the edition, but in particular the October 2025 update. And I will note here that there's a possibility I'll make some mistakes when I'm talking about this, because to my mind it has kind of all bled together. I may talk about things that were updated actually in N5 at release, but just generally, there has been a shift in the faction that I have found most notable since October 2025, especially around defensive pieces and middleweight elements. And this was a theme in the 2025 update generally. A lot of pieces in the game I find that sat between that 20 and 30 kind of points range saw some interesting attention from the design team. And that's been very beneficial to the texture of the game, because it's that kind of points bracket, right? More than 20, less than 30, that tends to need to work the hardest to justify itself. That's not particularly surprising. If you think about the composition of a list, you have 300 points and 15 troops, which means that the average cost per trooper is 20 points. Any trooper that costs less than 20 points, by definition, is saving you at least a little bit relative to that average that can be spent on other stuff. And expensive troopers, yes, they are expensive, but they usually justify themselves very clearly as an order outlet and part of the game plan of your list. It's not until you get to that 20 to 30 point bracket where you have troops that are above 20 points, and so by definition are drawing on your points reserve, the points that you've saved by making cuts elsewhere, but which maybe aren't powerful enough to carry the game by themselves on their lonesome. Troops at that points bracket are often single wound, for example, and so susceptible to bad luck relative to a 2-wound trooper. But Svalarheima has seen some changes where, especially troops that I would have very much overlooked in N4, make for some very compelling additions to the faction now. Perhaps they are specialists who are also gunfighters. Perhaps they are utility teams like the Varg, which have seen, in my mind, an enormous glow up, at least in terms of their role and utility in the faction, because disco is a hell of a drug and albedo is a more consistent rule than it's ever been before. And that has added texture to Svalarheima's list construction, which it really, really appreciates in responding to the challenges of ITS Season 17. And so, while at a high level, much of Svalarheima's identity remains very intact and something to celebrate, where the rubber hits the road and you are actually writing and playing a list is probably more interesting than it has ever been for this faction. And so let's talk about that a little bit. What are Svalarheima's strengths, limitations, and faction identity? In terms of strengths, direct power, good, strong pieces, and especially good, strong, close assault hasn't gone away. The close assault elements, in fact, have actually expanded in terms of the number of pieces we might feasibly choose from, with, Lankai, Shenokarano, and Valkyrie all being historic, good, or best in classes. But now we also have a profile that I'll be spending some time talking about, Hawkins. Good old Knight Hospitaller Kyle may actually be one of my single most favorite assault element shotgun door kicker profiles in the entire game. The difference is in how they are used. You're less likely to use these as a spearhead into the enemy deployment zone, as you are to use them as a spearhead into some part of this table that the scenario makes important. If we think back to my videos about CanCon and the scenario pack for CanCon, a through line that I observed in CanCon scenarios was how valuable it was to be able to secure parts of the game table, and Svalarheima is a faction that is exceptional at assaulting those parts of the game table, busting through enemy entrenched positions and defenses and seizing some part of the table that the scenario makes important, whether that's a parcel of HVTs that are bundled together in axial interference, or a drop-off zone for supplies in provisioning, or the prototypes in corporate appropriation, or an objective room, or whatever. Svalarheima has the same pieces they've always had, but now with more of those kind of elements that are very good at assaulting and seizing that territory. And that direct power as a faction identity carries on as it always has through its firepower, but now in N5 and in responding to some of the demands of the metagame, also in terms of Svalarheima's ARO. Svalarheima has, across a few units we will talk about in the army section, but especially just to call out now the Knight of Justice missile launcher, one of the single best, direct, straightforward, no mods, no frills, just tough as guts, rolling a ton of dice, representing an existential threat to anything that faces it, ARO pieces in the game. There is almost nothing that sees a linked Knight of Justice missile launcher in a high position in the enemy deployment zone somewhere across the table and goes, yeah, I would love to fight that. Like, nothing. No piece in the game is comfortable taking that engagement, short of a tiny number of the most apex gunfighters in the game, and even they have to respect the threat of a missile launcher. So direct power remains in terms of firepower, but in ITS Season 17 and in the post-October 2025 metagame, being able to just put a strong arrow piece up to pin back enemy advances is more important than it has been in some time, and Svalarheima responds to that in a very Svalarheima way. Another strength of the faction, and this is slightly more subtle, is a surprising amount of access to either specialists who can fight or specialists who can easily link with pieces that fight well, including in some cases forward positioned elements that combine those varied strengths. And that's some of those things that are key in responding and adapting to ITS Season 17 and presumably the coming ITS Season 18, where elements like Uma Sorensen and Kyle Hawkins, and even a bunch of the Locust profiles with their Mimetism -6 and Hidden Deployment, combine in one piece a very capable gunfighter and a specialist, which present a really efficient and direct line of play. And then finally, in terms of strengths, I would just note that as a Pan-Oceanian sectoral, really variable and versatile fire team. This is what we would expect of a Pan-Oceanian sectoral army, where there are a ton of different teams that you can assemble to do certain different things inside a list, whether it be ARO or that nice combination of firepower, close assault, and scenario objective play. But in Svalarheima, those fire teams do require perhaps a little bit more work at list construction than in some other Pan-Oceanian factions, because, and this leads us into the first of our limitations that Svalarheima has, they do not have access to the linkable tactical awareness pathfinder. And frankly, it's a little bit gross to me how strong the profile is that I have to call that out as a limitation. But there isn't really any getting around it. That pathfinder profile with tactical awareness can be taken in Svalarheima, but it is not a wildcard. And that fact alone is the main reason why I say Svalarheima has to work a little bit harder at the list construction stage to make the fire teams work really nicely. Other Pan-Oceanian factions get to just windmill slam that Pathfinder into any link they want much of the time, and get a full utility package, and a specialist, and tactical awareness for a very, very small number of points. We don't have that in Sval, and we just need to play and list build accordingly, although frankly, I'm probably still liable to include one of those in many lists just because of how efficient the profile is. Secondly, also calling out a model that we don't have access to, which is worth mentioning as a faction limitation, no red eye. So no vehicle, no aerial combat troop. Although I would note that if there was ever going to be a Pan-Oceanian faction where that's something we can live without, it's absolutely Svalarheima. The red eye in many other armies that it's fielded in does the thing that vehicles do, which is that it forces the enemy to post ARO pieces that can pin it back, or else threaten buzzing their deployment zone quickly, aggressively, and from the high vantage point afforded by Super Jump, which is not completely, but in many respects is kind of fundamentally a close assault role, and we aren't hurting for cool pieces that are a threat if they close in Svalarheima. But vehicles are very strong. The red eye is in about the top 50% of vehicles. It is a cool new thing in this edition, and we don't have access to it in Svalarheima. Next, in terms of limitations, no combat jump and effectively no parachuters. There is one profile that you might take from time to time, one of the blades, but in practice, assume that you're not going to have access to that kind of responsive forward deployment elements, right? You're not going to have access to combat jump, you're not going to have access to parachutist, but instead you will have access to hidden deployment, camouflage, pre-positioned forward elements. And while I wouldn't say that Svalarheima's midfield is a strength of the faction, it's absolutely much less of a weakness than it has ever been, and there are pieces that, depending on the scenario you're playing, you'll be very happy to make use of or include in lists, including elements that if I hadn't sat down and gone through the faction and spoken to Lockie, or had some recent play experiences against, I probably would have overlooked myself. Uma Sorensen in particular, I think, fits interestingly into that, oh, she's not half bad now kind of profile states, because she is a specialist with forward deployment and camouflage and surprisingly serviceable gunfighting, which, although she's no Dart, for example, from Acontecimento, is still a very capable profile that combines in one model the ability to directly and strongly perform in multiple roles, which is really valuable. And so overall, in terms of the strengths and limitations and how that combines into an identity for Svalarheima, that leaves us right now, ITS Season 17, post-October update, in the position of a faction that has strong and direct power in many of the arenas the game asks us to play, but with a particularly strong capability of assaulting mission-critical parts of the table, accomplishing what it needs to do, and then moving on to the next objective. It's a faction that has kind of left behind some of the previous identity it had of spending most of its orders first on shooting the enemy, then on stabbing the enemy, and then with 2 or 3 orders that were remaining pressing one button, and has replaced that with much of the same power, but with more nuance now in list construction, particularly around the middleweight elements that we're filling a list out with after we've added our premier pieces, and with an intention of pursuing and being rewarded by efficient lines of play that much more effectively balance firepower and assault and mission, with the assault now being more oriented on where in the table do we need to attack and seize to do what it is the mission asks of us. And that is very interesting. There is absolutely a certain joy in taking direct, solid, powerful pieces and in execution pursuing clean and effective lines of play, not just to the enemy's destruction, but to accomplishing the mission, which is how you win a game of Infinity. And with that, let's jump into army and start working through some troops, noting that we'll move a little bit more quickly here because in many cases a lot of the things that I have said about the video about the faction previously, including in the previous N4 faction focus, a lot of that does still hold, and so we'll move relatively quickly, where this is territory we've maybe covered before. So starting with Pan-Oceania Fusiliers, still a fundamentally important part of the faction, but taking a relatively backseat role these days, which has been a bit of a theme of N5. These guys are necessary to form a Fusilier fire team. The Fusilier fire team is often going to be one of the more efficient fire teams, can be a Haris or a Core, has some interesting elements that can join it, but the Fusiliers are the least important bit. You will basically never take the missile launcher or the heavy machine gun or the sniper. We are mostly here interested only in the lieutenant, the regular Fusilier with combi that acts as a lieutenant decoy, and then maybe either the paramedic in some cases and the hacker in others. The hacker, just because sometimes it's just very useful to have a hacker in lists. And while there are some interesting profiles these days that we have access to in Svalarheima that give us weirdly actually quite powerful hacking and network projection, those tend to come at quite a premium, and sometimes you don't want to pay that premium. In that case, a single Fusilier hacker makes all of your repeaters live against enemy hackable targets, and you can just stash him in the DZ as far back from enemy network projection as possible and hope that he stays safe and just projects that threat passively. The paramedic, because there are some pieces that we will link Fusiliers with that are high fizz heavy infantry, which frankly you'll probably speedball back given the opportunity, but having a paramedic is not bad. And that leads us pretty directly to the Knight of Justice. Now, technically, the Knight of Justice is a wild card. It can join any fire team, but what we're really interested in here most of the time is the missile launcher profile joining a Fusilier fire team. That's the top profile up there. Missile launcher, +1 special die. 46 points, but if we're just combining it with 2 Fusiliers, say a lieutenant and a decoy, that's 66 points for 3 troopers. That barely comes in over the 20 points average per trooper, and it's just a terrifyingly powerful ARO piece. It is a missile launcher, so you do have to manage its range bands, try and avoid putting it in positions where it can be ranged in under 24 inches. But even then, 3 dice on 14s on an Armor 5 BTS 9 platform with Religious, so it will stay standing if you wanted to, or even if you don't. And there is basically no model in the game that can accept an engagement with a missile launcher without sustaining at least some risk. That missile launcher alone is one of the strongest possible responses we can put to, say, enemy vehicles into a list, just saying, no, you actually have to suppress this thing because you can't cop a hit from a missile. Even a Hatham who has 3 wounds doesn't love the idea of sustaining that. They're probably going to have the pilot bailing out and then not be a vehicle for the rest of the game. Just very, very powerful, and a tool that we have to think about in the context of Svalarheima in N5. Now, there are some other profiles here that are interesting and relevant, and probably the most significant one is the hacker. Half an SWC, 45 points. We have a serviceable gunfighter. It's all of the same defensive stats, ballistic skill 14, damage 6 multi-marksman. However, a Team Crux, this guy isn't. The special die on Team Crux makes a big difference. The albedo on Team Crux isn't irrelevant either, but setting aside kind of that comparison, and especially the special die on Team Crux, if you judge it necessary at list construction, this is a profile with a ballistic skill 14 linkable pitcher, and who is a BTS 9 heavy infantry hacker. Especially if the enemy is fighting through your repeater networks, it is very possible even for the best hackers in the game to just not be able to put the Knight of Justice down. Now, for my money, 45 points for a Ballistic Skill 14 multi-marksman rifle is too expensive for most lists, but it is a piece to keep in your back pocket as worthwhile in some cases and plays into that, yeah, this is just directly strong. Like in terms of just directly strong and difficult to kill hackers, the Knight of Justice is one of the most difficult hackers to kill in the entire game and has some of the best network projection because Ballistic Skill 14 linkable pitchers are about as good as it gets in terms of pitcher ballistic skill. Mostly we're here for the missile launcher, and we are absolutely here for the missile launcher, but do keep the other profile in mind. Now, there are several profiles that we can also use to take a Fusilier link and turn it into an active or mobile fire team, and one of those is the Blade. Now, realistically, much of what the Blade is being is a tactical awareness pathfinder we have at home, because he is linkable and has tactical awareness, and the engineer profile carries a bunch of that kind of useful stuff, although I will note no deactivator, which is a little bit of a shame. But other engineer things, and it is a specialist with tactical awareness. The notable distinction that the Blade Operator enjoys relative to something like a Pathfinder wildcard in other factions is that it does actually count as a Fusilier. And so if you want a mobile fire team that starts with whatever generic Fusilier but still enjoys fire team options, you can do things like combine a Fusilier, a Blade, and an Orc. Or you can even do things like combine a Blade Operator with another piece that counts as a Fusilier and just leave the Fusilier at home and enjoy your duo bonuses as you move forward. Now, in terms of non-fire team options, we should also call out the Engineer with forward deployment and decoy. Now, this is not a piece that I would be rushing to put in too many lists. It is quite niche. But in his notes, Lockie mentions having had good results from it. And Decoy 2, although it's not camouflage, does provide enough obfuscation that it can be a little bit difficult and annoying and therefore not worth your opponent's time to try and move in and take out a piece like the Blade Engineer. And the weapons that the Blade Engineer has got, in particular that emitter, actually mean that it projects kind of a weird and interesting threat in the midfield that uses Decoy to make itself like very frustrating to try and pick out and attack, but at the same token is not easy to leave to its own devices. Because a Ballistic Skill 13, BSSR -1, Mimetism 3 emitter actually does potentially brick quite a large number of targets if it's allowed to shoot, and it's a specialist, and it has an AP submachine gun, and 30 points is not unreasonable. And it's in a piece like this that we start to see the emergence of those models in Svalarheima that are specialists who can fight, which theoretically applies to any of the Blade profiles. All of them have those kind of short-range weapons, good ballistic skill, extra damage, and mimetism, good reasonable armor and BTS for a light infantry as well. But for the FTO Blade profiles, usually we'd expect to combine them with maybe a slightly more fit-for-purpose option, whereas the Engineer comes to the battlefield forward positioned using forward deployment, and so is both more likely to need to, but is more likely to be positioned to, take at least one gunfight with either the emitter or the submachine gun by itself before it goes about doing some mission objective. And in terms of linking things like the Blade and Fusiliers with more fit-for-purpose close assault options, let's just get it out of the way and talk about Knight Hospitaller Kyle. Because I think this guy might actually just be my favorite profile in Svalarheima now, which is absolutely not something that I expected. And while theoretically both of these profiles have some merit, I'm going to particularly focus on the Ballistic Skill Attack +1 Burst boarding shotgun, because I think relative to the 26 points you pay for him, this might be the single best close assault shotgun door kicker model in the game. And okay, that's kind of a narrow archetype, but this is the kind of model. We've actually seen that kind of profile emerge over the course of N5 as being, oh yeah, this is one of the ways that you can launch close assaults. Lots of factions have access to some model that's modestly durable, but has either a +1 burst or +1 special die and often linkable boarding shotgun, and so is very good, usually like 6-2 move, some kind of mobility skill as well. And so while it isn't necessarily a close combat trooper, it's a very good close assault trooper because pieces like that can usually move forward, turn a corner, catch the enemy out of cover while they are in cover, and then take ideally like a 4-dice shot with a shotgun, which is just very dangerous. That's a really good kind of close assault archetype, and we can see it on things like the Asawira as a sort of standout example, but there are plenty of those in N5 now. And I think Kyle might just be the best of them, because 26, just to start with, 26 points is astoundingly cheap. Secondly, his link options are quite forgiving, and he counts as a Fusilier in a Fusilier fire team, but he also counts, for example, as a Knight Hospitaller if you want to run a Hospital duo, or you can just combine him in a Winter 4 Beta fire team with, say, a pair of Karhu. He has a +1 burst, ballistic skill 14, ballistic skill attack -3 boarding shotgun on an armor 3 BTS 6 2 wound profile, and especially that ballistic skill attack -3 coupled with ballistic skill 14 makes him, I think, just the best turn the corner fire the shotgun model in the game. And actually I did a little bit of math about this before recording this video. It is really hard to have a ballistic skill weapon outperform serviceable close combat. But in many cases, Kyle is actually more dangerous or better at fighting with his shotgun than with his CC23 Martial Arts 3 DACCW. Like, that gives you some kind of idea as to how good he is with that shotgun, because it is really hard to outperform a good quality martial artist in close combat, but it's damn close on that shotgun. Specifically, the delta is, if the enemy doesn't have a visibility mod, and your choice is between breaking cover to get into close combat or staying in cover against an out-of-cover enemy to shoot the shotgun is better. The shotgun is just better than the close combat, and that's astounding because this is a good close combat profile. On top of that, he has a flash pulse, excellent, a little bit of long-range ARO, He has a burst 2 template weapon to fork with the shotgun. Now, the shotgun is so lethal that you will almost always just fire the shotgun, but you do at least force your opponent to consider whether or not perhaps they should dodge. And then to top it all off, the thing that really makes him probably my favorite trooper in this archetype is that he's a specialist, which means you have in one fast, durable model a piece that can both assault an element of the board where there's something that we're trying to accomplish and then go about accomplishing that mission objective, be it pressing a button or something else that requires a specialist. He counts as a Fusilier, he counts as a Hospital Knight, and he is the newest addition to Svalarheima's roster of outstanding close assault elements, and realistically the only one with like maybe one or two exceptions that's also a specialist. And for me, that makes him very appealing to include in a significant number of lists. Really, really like Knight Hospitaller Kyle, and definitely one of the biggest pieces that has changed over the course of N5. From here, we'll talk about Orc troops, and in Svalarheima we have Winterforce Orc troops, which are a touch more expensive but have Climbing Plus, and Terrain Mountain, the more important thing there is Climbing Plus. This is the pretty standard suite of Orc Trooper stuff, and realistically we're going to be using these moderately sparingly, but they are serviceable, good ballistic skill, direct gunfighters. The things we're most interested in here are the heavy machine gun and the Huerback, a little pricey at 36, 37 points respectively, but they can link with Fusiliers, although they don't count as one, and they can form the basis of a Winter 4 Alpha Fire team, where they will share that Winter 4 Alpha keyword with anything else that has that keyword. That includes Vargs, but also notably Infirmaras, Hannibal, Valkyrie, etc. And so if you need a gun that shares a keyword, good enough, a good enough option. Climbing Plus helps play into that mobility theme that we see throughout Svalarheima, and Ballistic Skill 14 with a bunch of dice is Ballistic Skill 14 with a bunch of dice. Also, in terms of profiles that can link with Fusiliers but also link with a bunch of other stuff, we have the Karhu Special Group, and this is a profile that for a very long time was one of the reasons to play Svalarheima, and pretty reasonably still is. Lots of stuff exists in Svalarheima now in addition to the Karhu. Its dominance is no longer absolute, but one Karhu or two in a list is still very serviceable. Just because there is one regiment with NCO in Svalarheima and it's Karhu, and NCO is a really good skill to have one or two of in a list, particularly in Svalarheima, where sometimes we will have a very, very powerful active lieutenant in the form of the Jotun, but much of the rest of the time we'll just be taking a Fusilier as our LT. And so NCO is as good as TAC awareness, and the rest of the package here is as nice as it has ever been. 6-2 move, Climbing Plus, Mimetism -3, and MSV1 and Ballistic Skill 13, and just a serviceable package of profiles. Yes, the Feuerback is still the standout. This is a Burst 3 Feuerback that can be linked, therefore making it a Burst 3+1 Feuerback, which is a very, very dangerous gun. And yes, just like it was in previous editions where the Karhu existed, it's also armor 2 with a single wound, which means you are at some point playing these going to get crit by a combi rifle and really regret existence. Still a very, very worthwhile profile, and can be paired quite easily with, say, a Karhu Paramedic. There are plenty of things we might link with a pair of Karhu that can benefit from having a Paramedic to escort it around, and the two Karhu providing duo bonuses. It's a little pricey, for example, but a Karhu Feuerback, a Karhu Paramedic, and Kyle Hawkins is a terrifyingly dangerous fire team with a point man who can be recovered by the paramedic, and with good specialist redundancy. I don't think we'll see, or we shouldn't see in N5, the kind of list that we sometimes saw in N4, where the response to the fragility of Karhu, being single wound troopers, was to simply take 4 wounds worth of Feuerback Karhu. But we should absolutely still acknowledge that they're a very solid, very powerful troop and form part of Svalarheima's identity. Now, we have to, by necessity, jump around a little bit between fire teams here, because Svalarheima's fire teams are a little complicated and all over the place. As I mentioned, take a little bit of work to make work, but another significant fire team, and the basis of a fire team in Svalarheima, are the Vargar Maximum Security Team. And these guys are a regiment whose kind of day has finally come. I will say it, I just unironically like Varg now. And this is for a few reasons, but if I'm being blatantly honest, the first one is just that this is where you find a good disco ball profile in this faction, and disco balls are very, very valuable because they are visibility control, and visibility control wins you games when firepower fails. That's just a capability that is worth having in a list, and Varg duos work really comfortably. Varg count as Winter 4 Alpha, so they can link with, say, an Orc if you want a gun that isn't a Varg, or you can just take, for example, the 24-point Varg forward observer with Disco Ball. He's a forward observer, he has a combi rifle, a heavy flamethrower, a flash pulse, a disco baller, and a deactivator, which is kind of nice on a forward observer profile. And then combine it either with the K1 marksman rifle mine layer EM mine profile. If you're SWC starved, that's actually a serviceable secondary gun. K1 is still a pretty good ammunition type, and EM mine layer is nice. And 26 points is just about affordable for what you get, and you're looking for special die bonuses in addition to everything else. Or, if you're looking for a really cheap option, the heavy rocket launcher at 22 points has that heavy rocket launcher discount, which makes it relatively cheap in terms of points, just more expensive in terms of SWC. It deserves a shout out because it's a forward observer in addition to the forward observer deactivator disco ball profile, which just gives you a ton of specialist redundancy. And hey, there's that theme in Svalarheima again of models that can fight and who are also specialists, and in this case, who are also mobile. And so, yes, Varg don't have mimetism, they don't have visors. They have a visibility mod, Albedo, and in N5, just a little bit of albedo on a model with a decent gun can be really nice to have. Like, you don't want to spam albedo. Its trigger point is still much rarer than mimetism, so you don't want to have, like, reliance on it. But 1 or 2 gunfighters with albedo in a list opens options that didn't exist previously. And even if we set aside albedo, 6-2 move, ballistic skill 13, armor 3, BTS 3, super jump. Cool. These are mobile, versatile specialists who can fight. Excellent. That's what I want in Svalarheima. That's one of the things the faction can do, and the fact that we can combine this with, say, an Orc Winter 4 Alpha if you want a different firepower profile, or even get weird with wild cards and start building out something like a Hannibal, Valkyrie, Orc, Vargar team, all of which counts as Winter 4 Alpha and gives us some very interesting options in terms of how that list plays. There's an awful lot going on here for a profile that previously in prior editions was kind of a hear me out, we can make this work sort of meme. Now, no, I just like this. I like this because I like disco, but starting from that point, we can move on to some genuine capability. And since we're jumping around here, let's briefly work through those Winter 4 Alpha and Wildcard pieces, starting with the Infirmaries of St. Lazarus. Counts as Winter 4 Alpha, 6-2 move, Doctor, 17 points for a boarding shotgun. Yes, it has a sword, doesn't matter. What we care about here is that this is a relatively cheap, linkable, keyworded Doctor with a good movement profile. Excellent, cool. All of the rest of the stuff, it's got martial arts and CC21. That may matter occasionally. It's not why we're taking it. 17 points is below the 20-point threshold. Doctor is potentially very useful in the teams that it's joining. And the keyword means it contributes to fireteam bonuses, which can actually get us weirdly high fireteam bonuses in some of these teams. Valkyrie and Hannibal are the next two to discuss, and Valkyrie is one of those models that we talk about when we talk about par excellence close assault pieces. Now, of all of the close assault pieces that we work with in Svalarheima, Valkyrie these days is one of the ones that I will reach for kind of least, but is very solid. The major downside that she has is that she's 4-4 move. She has Berserk to make up for that a little bit, and so she has like a clean line of play where she can turn a corner, take a shotgun attack, then declare Berserk, get into close combat, take a close combat attack, and she's very good in close combat and very dangerous. But of all of the close assault pieces that we'll be talking about, she's the one that doesn't have a mobility skill. She does have link keywords, which is what makes up for it, but if we compare her, for example, to Kyle Hawkins, she is more expensive and less dangerous. So the reason why you might reach for her is, 1, you have Kyle Hawkins already. 2, you for some reason you strongly value immunity enhanced. It's a very good skill, and you have specific reason to take it. Or 3, you're looking to play with those fire team keywords, and the fire team flexibility is ultimately what sets Valkyrie apart, in addition to being unhackable, from Kyle. Kyle I would reach for in a vacuum, Valkyrie I would reach for if I have some specific plan that revolves around Winter 4 Alpha teams. Our second Winter 4 Alpha keyworded, or third, I guess, keyworded piece that we're interested in talking about here is Hannibal Mercenary Team Leader. And look, frankly, I'm going to say very similar things to what I said about the Blade, which is we have the wildcard Pathfinder attack-aware at home. It's Hannibal. He's much more expensive, and if we had, look, in fact, I want to say there are factions that have access to Hannibal and also have access to the Pathfinder, and it's just like, why would you? But in this case, we can't wildcard a Pathfinder into a fire team. We can wildcard Hannibal in, and so he deserves a little bit of attention for that reason. Because once we set aside the comparison with the game's most overpowered remote, we actually get a pretty solid package of stuff here. Counterintelligence is a worthwhile skill to include as a one-of. Sensor is a very useful skill. Tactical awareness on a linkable model is a very useful skill. Ballistic skill 13 with ballistic skill attack +1 special die and decent dodging and no wound incapacitation actually makes him just an annoying little prick to have to try and kill. You don't want to have to take active turn gunfights with him terribly often, but if you do, turning a corner with a 4-dice Vulcan shotgun, even if 2 of them are special die, that can do some work. And so, yes, he is definitely much more expensive and probably less overall useful, particularly relative to his cost, than a Pathfinder attack-aware FTO. But we don't have that here, and we do have him, and so it's worth considering him, particularly as part of a play for a higher order count Svalarheima list. There is some definite utility here. And as a mild correction, I did just go and check. There is no faction Hannibal works for that also includes linkable Pathfinders. He only works in Svalarheima and Whitecoat, and while both of those are either Pan-Oceanian or Pan-Oceanian themed, neither has linkable Pathfinder FTO wildcard options. Jumping around inside fire teams, again, we have the Svalarheima Nisses, which is to say Karhu before Karhu were cool and who've seen glow-ups over the years. These days, Ballistic Skill 13, MSV2, Mimetism -3, good armor, no BTS, 6-2 move, and access to... We're really only interested in the SWC gunfighting profiles here, usually the heavy machine gun. You can duo them with a Winter 4 Engineer as the cheapest way to get duo bonuses, and the Nisse comes in at 3 points cheaper for the heavy machine gun than the Karhu Feuerback, but realistically much of the time we're probably more likely to take the Karhu. It can join more fire teams. Neither the Karhu nor the Nisse really have much in the way of keywording flexibility or options. It's really just that Engineer if you want something that counts as a Svalarheima Nisse. But there are a few options where you might take the Svalarheima Nisse instead of the Karhu. And yeah, look, 4 dice is more than 3 dice, 5 dice is more than 4 dice. In a faction without smoke, the MSV2 doesn't make a huge difference relative to the MSV1, but it is a difference. And the points differential matters as well. So Nisses are an option that can be taken, and you'll see them appear in lists occasionally. Just for completeness, the Machinist is on screen now, and notably is a wild card. And so any of the fire teams that the Nisses can join, you can have a Machinist join as well and get your fire team bonuses that way. Now, moving on through a bunch of other profiles quickly, because there really is all of this interesting fire team soup option in Svalarheima, and you kind of just have to explore that yourself. Talking briefly about the Hospitaller Knights. These are guys that I have had a soft spot for basically forever because their sculpts are awesome and I have always wanted them to be good. And they basically never have. They were always, at best, a piece you can kind of make work. And there is a small change that has occurred since even the N5 update that kind of maybe shifts the needle on them, and that update is just that Kyle exists now. Kyle, you're the best, and because of Kyle Hawkins, a Knight Hospitaller heavy machine gun is weirdly appealing. Yes, it's just a slightly cheaper orc with frenzy and some close combat skills and better BTS. Okay, that's fine. It's a Hospitaller, it's a big gun, and Kyle counts as a Hospitaller, and Kyle is excellent. And so in one fire team, for really relatively few points, we can have Kyle Hawkins, shotgun specialist, door kicker extraordinaire, and then a Knight Hospitaller heavy machine gun, putting 5 dice of HMG rounds down range. Cool, that's it. That's the duo. That does everything that you might possibly need. The only thing you can't do is reconstitute downed members, and Speedball exists for that. It's a very clean, very efficient team. Even the movement values I don't particularly mind, because sometimes having 4-4 move and 6-2 move mixed in the team can be a little bit awkward, but in this case it just gets you the positioning that you want anyway. The Hospitaller Knight with the heavy machine gun wants to be slightly behind, Kyle wants to be slightly forward. They will just organically adopt that kind of position anyway. I would prefer the Knight to be 6-2, but it is what it is. And while realistically we can accomplish much of the same, by taking a Fusilier and an Orc and Kyle and running a Haris. Firstly, that uses one of our 2 Haris slots, and secondly, it requires pulling a Fusilier into danger, and it does still cost more points overall. So if ever there has been a time for me to live my dream of playing Hospital Knights, it's right now. Less off of their back than off of the back of Kyle, but hey, I'll take it. Getting into the more expensive end now, linkable, yes, we have Boig troops. These can form part of Winterfall beta fire teams alongside Karhu, Knights Hospitaller, Hawkins, and they are a piece I really want to be good, but are not yet a piece I am fully convinced by. But if ever there was a time for them to be used, it probably is now. They are probably better than they have ever been. What do we get for our points here? Well, firstly, they're not cheap. 44 points each. We are paying either 1.5 SWC or 0 SWC for a missile launcher or a Mark 12. In both cases, ballistic skill attack +1 burst, so that's a burst 2 missile or a burst 4 Mark 12. And X-Visor, which is almost useless on the missile launcher and modestly useful on the Mark 12. Disco balls with very high ballistic skill, and Albedo. Ultimately, the points cost here, even for an Armor 5 BTS 6 trooper, is just a little bit difficult to bear. As an Albedo trooper, these guys kind of, in fact, and with a disco ball, these guys kind of compete very directly with the Varg, and the Varg give us the niche option of a gun-fighting Albedo troop, only 1 point less ballistic skill, obviously not heavy infantry, and access to the disco ball at a much, much cheaper price point. Now, theoretically, we could form some kind of an interesting Haris team here, where we had the Boig as the basis of a Winterfall beta fire team and then wildcarded 2 things in, but that's a long walk for a short drink. I do absolutely think it could work. I'd probably be most inclined to do something like Boig Mark 12, Infirmera, Hannibal, which is a Winterfall beta fire team that is getting duo bonuses from 2 Winterfall alpha troopers. But is that better than the other options that we have? Well, look, I really like disco balls. We have a doctor, we have tactical awareness, we have a sensor, we have a close range profile in the form of Hannibal, we have a long to medium range profile in the forms of the Boig. It's a team that could absolutely work. I'm just not reaching for it immediately. And finally, just to run through some of the other wildcards before we move on, Shona Carano. Shona is particularly interesting in Svalarheima in that she is a wild card and so can link wherever she wants, but doesn't necessarily have to. Because she is 6-2 move with super jump, she's also extremely capable just being unlinked and running off and killing things by herself, and her close combat is as par excellence high damage as it's ever been. In a scenario, for example, like corporate appropriation, she is often just going to run off into the distance herself with one thing on her mind, which is to close in on and destroy the corporate appropriation prototype, which of every model in the game, she's one of the ones with the best chance of killing it in one order. She is very, very focused in that respect. She is only a close combat model. She is not a specialist. She does nothing else, but she links easily if you want to link her. She moves very fast. And if she gets into close combat with almost anything in the game, that thing is dead. 22 points, not bad at all. Finally, in terms of wildcards, and there are some things we'll talk about that are wildcards we'll kind of mention in other contexts, Troll Hunter Gunnar Lundmark. And this is a guy with a tremendous number of skills and who is single wound. But in responding to certain scenario pressures, does give us some interesting options. Now, actually, for my money, I think, even though we've mentioned him in the context of fireteam options, I think it might actually be his decoy profile with forward deployment that is more interesting. As a fireteam wildcard, the most interesting thing about him is his keywords. He counters both a Fusilier and a Karhu, and those are weirdly valuable tags to have in a fire team, because one Fusilier plus Gunner, or any of the things that count as Fusiliers, like Kyle Hawkins or a Blade, that's cool, that's interesting. And then, of course, Karhu can join many links, but never count as anything but themselves, so counting as a Karhu gives us some really interesting options there. But if we're stapling him into a fire team, well, he's very, very expensive, 30 points for the fire team profile. And what do we get there? Well, we get tactical awareness, that's really good, and he's a specialist operative, that's useful. Climbing plus is really nice as well. But in that fire team configuration, we will almost always be using him to deliver something else. He's not the star of the show himself. And so I'm kind of called toward the forward deployment profile, where he's most likely to actually be able to kind of trade on his merits. CC23, Ballistic Skill 13 with Mimetism, and there we go, the thing that I love, Boarding Shotgun +1 burst, particularly on a climbing plus troop with forward deployment who is hidden amongst those decoys. Decoy 2 adds just enough fog of war that he's actually probably very annoying to try and be like, oh yeah, that's the real one. Like, okay, it could be one of several. He's got a boarding shotgun, he's got a chain colt, he's not exactly defenseless at close range. And with that forward deployment and tactical awareness, he's well positioned to be that kind of piece that we see these days in Svalarheima, which is the person who is a specialist and who can also fight and who comes, in this case, pre-staged. And so as part of a sort of independent, do the scenario, kill the thing plan, I don't mind Gunnar Lundmark at all. He is expensive. But once we're choosing to make plays with that Burst 3, BS13, Climbing Plus, Mimetism, Boarding Shotgun, I like him a lot more than I did previously. Definitely a model that you want to take only in consideration of certain scenario requirements. But he comes pre-staged, he can do the mission, there's a huge number of classifieds he can accomplish. And if we're willing to spend the points, he's most likely, I think, to show his quality, able to play off and alone by himself. And that kind of leads us, I think, into Indigo Spec Ops Captain Uma Sorensen, who, strictly speaking, actually can play a lot like Gunnar. She's got multiple FTO options. When she's in FTO, she counts as both a Fusilier and a Nisse, but I don't think that's where she functions best. I think she functions best in her camouflage profile, where she has surprise attack, camouflage, forward deployment +8, a burst 4 submachine gun, EM mines, a burst 3 silence pistol, and climbing plus, stealth, and specialist operative. And it's that specialist operative, again, that we start to see this emergence, the continuation of this emergence of Svalarheima's new identity of having just a whole bunch of these troops who are specialists who can fight. And in any other faction, you do still see these things. But if I was looking at a Yuching model that was doing something like this, it would be Ballistic Skill 11. The fact that Uma Sorensen has 4 dice hitting on 13s with climbing plus for mobility, yes, it's a submachine gun, but that's a genuinely strong ability to win a gunfight, at least one gunfight off the back of Mimetism 3 and Surprise Attack. I actually had a game just recently where I had gotten Sheshkin up to 4 wounds, and Uma Sorensen just was the model on the spot. And okay, there may have been some dice involved. It's not terribly often that I'll be forced to pass 4 defense rolls. Sorry, 7 armor rolls off the back of 4 dice worth of attacks. That is a thing that happened. But there are relatively few models in the game that stand a chance of putting 4 wound Sheshkin all the way to unconscious in one go, and Uma Sorensen did that. Now, okay, yes, he rolled a hit and 3 crits. Don't do the math on that. Instead, take this as a little bit of an example of, hey, this is a model who costs less than 30 points, more than 20, and is a forward-deploying camouflaged specialist where if she needs to just kill something that's guarding an objective, she has 4 dice on 13s with Mimetism and Surprise Attack. She can gunfight. Like, objectively, 4 dice on 13s with mods, that's a gunfighting profile. And having that, even single wound, on a model that is a specialist with forward deployment, that's valuable in the slot. That makes excellent use of a troop slot, and it even makes pretty serviceable use of the points that you're spending. And we can combine her with some other independent operators in the midfield, including things under camouflage, to provide a little bit of obfuscation. And that is where pieces like the Beast Hunter come in. Now, I am not a Beast Hunter enjoyer. I don't love Beast Hunters, but I do love having Uma protected by the presence of some other camouflage markers. And if I want other camouflage markers in the midfield, my choices, particularly ones with Mimetism 3, my choices are relatively limited. And look, the 17 points isn't cheap, but the 17-point Panoceania Beast Hunter, it has 2 heavy flamethrowers. That gives it a really genuinely very dangerous template in the midfield presence. And while I probably wouldn't personally be reaching for one if I wasn't taking Uma in the list, once I've taken Uma Sorensen, I kind of do want something to add a little bit of confusion as to what exists under different camouflage markers, and the Beast Hunter provides that in addition to being a very dangerous template, Panzerfaust, AP Mine. Yes, I'm not going to call it a close combat piece because CC21 alone does not a close combat model make, but the elements otherwise are sound and useful and give us just a little bit of midfield, which is traditionally something that we might have said Svalarheima kind of lacks. On a similar note, and performing a very important role in our responses to scenario pressure in Svalarheima in 2025, 2026 these days, we have the Locust, who is also actually just kind of good now. And the really significant change, the skill that the Locusts picked up that makes them actually thoroughly playable, is hidden deployment. Now, it would probably be nice if they were camouflage hidden deployment troopers. Some of them do have camouflage. The generic hacker has camouflage one use, but the big weakness Locusts always had historically was that, yeah, they had Mimetism 6 and Infiltration, but they did not have any way of being protected, and so the enemy could go after them on the enemy's first turn and usually just secure kills, because Mimetism 6 is very nice, but single wound is single wound, and they were expensive midfield pieces. These days, hidden deployment solves that. Locusts will always be able to act first, which, barring extreme sensor countermeasures from your opponent, lets them always at least have a shot at accomplishing what it is that they want to accomplish. Whether that is gunfighting or hacking projection or mission play, they get to do it rather than just be scalpeled out on turn one. And that makes all of the difference in the world. And once we have them actually taking engagements and making use of their various different skills, yeah, totally serviceable. There are a variety of different profiles here. My personal favorites are the specialist operative with boarding shotgun grenades and drop bears, just because I'm a sucker for drop bears and it's a specialist. But realistically, the one that we probably want to make the most use of is the killer hacking device, because there's a lot going on here, and this is a genuinely solid profile. So it's a KHD, Willpower 13, BTS 3. It brings its own pitcher, which is pre-positioned in the midfield, and it has a firewall, and it's got a breaker combi rifle. And this is actually a profile where I really valued that kind of a weapon. Ballistic skill 12, mimetism 6, surprise attack, ability to enter and re-enter a marker state, and then that armor piercing against BTS burst 3 weapon. We have, once again, a piece that, firstly, it is protected early in the game. It's hidden, it does not need to engage the enemy at all. And then when it wants to, it's a Burst 3 BS12 Mimetism 6 relatively dangerous weapon, armor piercing against BTS, that is also a specialist. So we have that forward deployed specialist that can fight. Not cheap, 28 points, but once again letting us take Svalarheima, traditionally a very direct faction, and respond again to the scenario. Respond to scenario demands, respond to ITS Season 17, with a model that can do missions very efficiently because it comes pre-deployed, but which can also fight around that objective if it needs to. So the Locust KHD in particular, I really like. Also a bit of a sucker for the drop bears, but realistically the 28-point profile is probably the best one, although we might find some use for the regular hackers as well. Now, just while we're talking about this kind of trooper, we will mention in pass the Nokken, which has probably mostly been superseded by the Locust. It is still much cheaper, and that's pretty relevant. And there are some interesting options that we have here. My personal favorite would be the boarding shotgun +1 burst forward observer Panzerfaust. 22 points for a model that comes pre-positioned and can really close around a corner and be very threatening thanks to the visibility mod is not half bad. The mine layer also potentially presents some options. It's one of the few ways to get another Mimetism 3 marker in the midfield. Even if it will be a little bit telegraphed what's going on there, that still offers some protection by obscurity for pieces like Uma and the Beast Hunter. But fundamentally, the Nokken retains the vulnerability that the Locust lost, which is that it's predictable where it is and it can be scalpeled out against an opponent that's really threatened by it. Most opponents won't be. The damage that is posed, the threat that is posed by the Nokken is not enormous, but a Burst 3 boarding shotgun with Mimetism 6 in the right place at the right time, especially on a model that is itself a specialist operative, there are worse ways to spend 22 points. And so in some scenarios, I could see reaching, especially for the forward observer or potentially the mine layer Nokken, but most of the time I would be looking for a slightly more expensive, but more fit for purpose troop. Now, just a couple of things to mention before we wrap this up with a sample list, and of course we must discuss the Jotun. I'm not going to dwell on the Jotun in depth because frankly I've covered him in completeness in the N4 faction focus, and he's one of the pieces that hasn't really changed. The Jotun is Ballistic Skill 15 and Armor 10 and BTS 9. That's it. There you go. He is built like a brick shithouse, he has very good ballistic skill, and he will fight the things until the things fall down. The big thing about the Jotun is just that it's not a snap pick in any list pair that we might be taking Svalarheima in. We are more so than ever these days free to play without one. But being free to play without the toughest tag in the game is not the same as saying you shouldn't play with the toughest tag in the game, because there are lists and circumstances where a massive firepower, crit immune, armor 10 piece is just really, really good, because those are the biggest numbers, and it can absolutely be worth paying 82 points for the biggest collection of tag stats around. Good piece. And if you are interested in picking up Svalarheima, you should at least have some interest in playing him, because he's part of the texture and theme of the faction, and playing Svalarheima is the only way to access an armor 10 model in the game, period. And then finally, before we drift into a few last shout out things you may not have considered, the thing we should absolutely talk about is Lankai. Lankai is still Lankai and is still very, very good. A very fast, very dangerous close combat model, and at 21 points is still realistically cheap enough to comfortably take in Svalarheima if you want to. What has changed is that I don't necessarily think he is an auto-include snap pick selling point of the faction as much as he used to be. Especially as we shift toward responding to very demanding, mission-oriented, order-intensive scenarios, Lankai, who is not linkable and who is not a specialist, is purely a close assault, close combat element, needs to be thought about a bit more in terms of whether or not we take him. Now, at 20 points, the danger that he presents still absolutely makes him worthwhile. He's very, very good, just to be very clear about that. But I think he's shifted to a troop that you add to your list once you're sure that you can, rather than one of the first two models you add to a list regardless of the scenario. If you like him, you can still 100% take him, and he's very good, but he's more of a 12th, 13th, 14th model we add to a list rather than a first one. If you do take him though, very fast, make use of his impetuous, let him get forward, stab something really, really hard, trade up into some expensive and dangerous enemy model, inflict 7 hits on it in one go, kill an iguana all the way to dead in one shot, live your best life, etc. Great piece. Now, we've covered a huge amount of ground in this section so far, and this video is getting definitely long enough, but there's just one last piece that I'm going to mention in response to a shout out that Lockie included specifically in his notes, and that is Agni's the Rim Driver profile. And this is something that I wouldn't have thought to have mentioned myself, but defenses and defensive elements are very important in N5. There are lots of pieces, particularly vehicles in the game, that we want to present an ARO element that pins them back. And giving +1 ballistic skill, and +5 CC I guess, but +1 ballistic skill to a total reaction HMG actually moves the needle on it reasonably significantly. Now, I wouldn't pay 16 points for that by herself, but she's a specialist operative and a wild card, and absolute worst case scenario, a linked submachine gun with a nanopulsar as a template weapon is not the worst thing in the game to have to turn a corner with. You don't want to, but if you are taking her as a serviceable enough link filling element, she doesn't count as anything, but she can comfortably add another specialist, for example, to a fire team or be moved up the field as part of a fire team, then 16 points for that, and the order, and the +1 ballistic skill to either a Thunderbolt or a heavy machine gun Sierra Dronbot, that starts to show some value. And if you're not looking to spend an awful lot of points on a Knight of Justice, and perhaps you've got a Nisei, and the Nisei is linked with a machinist, and you'd like to take a baggage bot in order to reload your disco balls, well, you've got all of the components there already to make a total reaction bot a really dangerous ARO piece. You can give it marksmanship, you can give it +1 ballistic skill, you have an engineer to repair it and make use of that remote presence. And so just to think about a little bit of the texture and nuance that exists in Svalarheima's overall list construction, just making one last shout out, a model you may not have considered, Angus Ferreria, Rim Driver profile, can meaningfully add to our defensive mix to pin back those powerful and dangerous aggressive pieces that you need to be able to defend against in N5. And with that, to tie this all together, let's just take a look at a sample list that makes use of many of the pieces that I've talked about. And make no mistake, this is absolutely kind of a sample platter list. There were lots of different things that I wanted to get into to throw into this list, and I couldn't include them all, and that is very promising from a list construction perspective. I wasn't able to include a Yotum. I even wasn't able to include Leng Kai, and it's very possible that's a mistake. But I was able to fit a lot of the other things I'm personally excited for. And just to note, although Lockie did provide me with a number of lists just as showcases potential candidates ahead of recording this episode, none of them had Kyle Hawkins in, and so I had to write one for myself. And so from the top, what we have is a 3-person Fusilier Harris team, consisting of a Karhu, a Blade FTO, and a Fusilier Paramedic. This is very single wound, and actually may almost end up serving better in the second combat group. That's something to consider. If you play a list like this, consider whether or not they play well in group 2, because some of the value might actually just be on having NCO and tactical awareness to move that paramedic around, because there are a few things in this list we might find ourselves hitting with the old special dice Medidart over the course of the game. Still, Karhu is a Karhu. This link has 2-person fire team bonuses because the Blade counts as a Fusilier, and it's a very mobile fire team with a bunch of orders. We then have the Knight Hospitaller FTO and Hawkins. Now, something to consider is that in some cases we might actually just slam Hawkins into that Karhu Fusilier team. I wanted to write a list with the Knight Hospitaller and Hawkins duo because that personally tickles me, but realistically, much of the time, you know what else is really good on Hawkins? An NCO and a tactical awareness order to get him forward. So that's just something to consider. This is a little bit of a personal consideration, my own vanity pick. You could very easily cut the Hospitaller FTO heavy machine gun, free up some points from SWC, and move Hawkins into the larger fire team, at which point you actually just leave the Fusilier behind. Like, you can just leave the Fusilier paramedic back in the DZ next to the Knight of Justice, and have the Blade, Karhu, and Hawkins move forward, because that is a Fusilier fire team, and Hawkins and the Blade both give those bonuses. We then have another fire team duo, a Varg Forward Observer and a Varg Combi Rifle. So Varg Forward Observer HRL and a Varg Forward Observer Combi Rifle Disco. This is present for the Disco. Something I would have liked to have included in this list but didn't quite have the points is that Shona Carano works very well in this team if you run it as a Haris. All of them have super jump, it's a very fast team, you have albedo gunfighting, but more importantly, you have one of the best close combat models in the game with linked disco in the same team. So give that some consideration as well. Varg, Shona, or anything Varg, Shona, provided you have those special die bonuses, really nice as a mobile, dangerous fire team. We then have a Fugazi, a Mulebot, and a Warcore. The Mulebot is probably the most important piece here because there are a few things we want to reload. There's a pitcher in Group 2, and of course the Disco in Group 1. In Group 2, we have that Fusilier Knight of Justice fire team. Now, frankly, I personally wouldn't object to taking the occasional gunfight with that Knight at all. If I've outranged a heavy machine gun total reaction bot, for example, or any other piece, if I'm at like 38 inches against an ARO piece that's going to be on like a Feuerback, for example, or a Thunderbolt, yeah, I'll spool up that missile and take an active turn shot. 3 dice, even if 2 of them are special die, I only need to connect once with Knight of Justice. But the main purpose of that team is to be a very durable, very dangerous, threatening of catastrophe ARO team in a metagame that kind of warrants that. And then to round this combat group out, we have the Locust, Hidden Deployment, Killer Hacker, Firewall, Pitcher. Gives us a little bit of KHD. I value that in this list because some of our close assault is Hawkins, who is heavy infantry, and it's a forward deploying, hidden deploying specialist. And then finally a Pathfinder, because fuck you, I'm going to take one anyway. I don't care if I can't link it, it's still incredibly high utility, and incidentally means this list has an NCO and 2 TAC-aware orders. That's really cool. That Pathfinder will often be very good at spending a bunch of the orders in the second combat group to either go and accomplish some specialist objective or to support the advance, like maybe by removing mines, of some of the forward pieces. And so while I think that you could absolutely refine this more, realistically, the Hospitaller Knight in particular is probably a vanity pick. And doing something like cutting him, for example, for Shona Carano to link with the Varg would be much more efficient and probably more dangerous. I wanted my knights to be knights. If you cut that, there's a bunch more room to move here. Still, I would comfortably play this list into almost any mission. It's got tons of orders, it's got 4 powerful active SWC weapons, it's got a little bit of force reconstitution, and it's got great close assault, and it is not hurting at all for specialists. So by all measures, right, an efficient, strong, good quality list, and serving in this case particularly as a showcase of just how much has changed with Svalarheima Winterforce, because this is not a list I don't think I would ever have written before N5, and certainly not a list I would have written just following N5's release before the October update and the changes to the competitive environment brought on by ITS Season 17. So, if nothing else, I hope this might serve as an interesting palate cleanser and as a showcase for how Svalarheima can do things differently these days. And more generally, I hope you've enjoyed this discussion through Svalarheima's Winterforce. Once again, big thanks to Lockie for providing a lot of the notes that went into this video. As mentioned, my experience with Panosciania's Svalarheima Winterforce is relatively limited in N5, whereas Lockie has gone and won an event with them. So big thanks again. Without you, this episode would not have been possible. And to everyone else, I hope very much that you've enjoyed this. Quick channel plug. As a reminder, if you'd like to support the channel, you can do so via the Buy Me a Coffee link in the video description below, or by becoming a channel member on YouTube. We release Infinity about every week, and occasionally cover other games as well, games like Conquest Last Argument of Kings, and I hope to cover StarCraft when it releases. Otherwise, that concludes your Infinity video for this week. I hope very much that you've enjoyed it, and I will see you, as always, next week.